This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
It's high time, and indeed perhaps overtime, for me to say more and more directly to the central questions. How I come to my atheist position, and what reasons there are for thinking that that position is correct. Nevertheless, before returning again to the treatment direct, which I began in my third slot on Monday night, I want to try yet once more to satisfy Dr. Warren about the objectivity of value. Certainly, I do not regret the time we've already spent on this and on evolutionary theory and differences of degree, for these also are relevant matters, even if their relevance may seem a little indirect, and they're certainly important as well as, I think, relevant. Now, Dr. Warren believes that one cannot consistently hold that anything is categorically wrong or right, bad or good, while at the same time denying that these values are sustained by a creator. Without that support by a creator, it is suggested, we should be left only with arbitrary individual or group preferences. The imperatives of duty would be without authority, without any standing in the universe. Now, I want to say right away that I fully sympathize with and share the concerns behind this kind of protest. People feel, and I sympathize with their feeling, that the decencies of good families and good communities must be threatened if there are no solid standards to live by. And in this, though I don't draw the same theological implications that they do, I'm sure that these people are right. I say, believe it or not, I have myself been married for 23 years to my first and only wife, and I'm a doting father of 2 daughters, so this sort of concern for the values of a decent family and a decent community is something I share. Again, I fully share Dr. Warren's outrage against the monstrosities of the Nazi era. And I'm much the happier to go along with him about this, since I know that he is not one of those, too common in my own doomed country, who would find the same frightful cruelties entirely acceptable if they were the work of a socialist or communist government in Russia or Cambodia or wherever else. Dr. Warren, I know, is not in this like the Labour Union leaders in Britain, who entertained as an honoured guest the former head of the Russian secret police, the sometime director of the Gulag archipelago. All this, I may say, at just about the same time as their American opposite numbers were similarly honouring, more honourably, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Still, though I fully share these concerns about values, which are not an arbitrary matter of individual or group preference, I do not agree that an appeal to divine support can do what Dr. Warren and so many others are sure that it can do. We need, I think, to distinguish 2 sorts of support which a God might be believed to provide for a system of values. The first of these sorts of support, which I think is not what Dr. Warren has been asking for, I believe could be provided. The second sort of support, which as I understand it, is what Dr. Warren has been asking for, I think could not be provided. We can deal with the first and here irrelevant sort of support in short order. Certainly, a God could lay on rewards and punishments for those who satisfied or failed to satisfy the practical requirements of whatever system of values that God might choose to support. And, of course, any offender against the requirements of any system thus supported by an all-powerful and all-knowing being will most certainly be detected and convicted. Here I think of the poster issued by the Christian Democratic Party in Italy during their elections in 1948. It showed an elector in the privacy of the polling booth, and the caption read, "Stalin can't see you, but God can. Vote Christian Democrat." And on that occasion, apparently, there were enough Catholic believers in Italy who took their religion seriously to ensure a very satisfactory Christian Democrat vote. However, it's not that sort of support which is in question, at any rate not here and now. The idea here, as I understand it, is that standards of justice, compassion, and so on can only be genuinely authoritative insofar as these standards are endorsed and given their authority by a creator. And if this is right, then anyone who allows that any such standards do have an authority transcending any individual or group preferences is thereby committed to recognizing the existence of God. Certainly, it's a perfectly sound argument, but I think the premise of this sound argument is false. For to recognize standards as being correct and authoritative does not, in fact, assume either that these standards are supported by a creator, or that it is precisely and only that supreme endorsement which makes them the authoritative, correct standards. To make this point clear, consider again slightly different version of that old question first formulated in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro. Are any arrangements which are just because God supports them, or does God support any arrangements which are just because they are just? Now apply this to the question of whether the arrangements under which it is said God provides for the saved eternal bliss and for the damned eternal torment. And suppose now, considering those alleged arrangements, someone says, as I would say, that it would be absolutely wrong to keep any conscious being, man or animal, in such torment forever. And furthermore, that it would be to the last degree monstrously unjust for a creator himself to punish his own creatures in that way. Now, is the correct reply to that sort of challenge the reply that, since these are the divine arrangements, and since arrangements are just precisely and only because God supports them, therefore these arrangements must be just by definition, and that's that? Certainly some Christians, and perhaps most Muslims, have taken this first option. I don't think it would be unfair to Calvin and to such leading Calvinists as Jonathan Edwards in what later was to become this country. I don't think it would be unfair to them to say that this is the option which they took or take at least part of the time. Now, anyone who does take that option clearly makes their religion a worship of absolute infinite power as such. On the lips of such a person, the claim that his God is always just amounts to no more than the rather unedifying claim that his God always does what he, that God, wants. And while that may be very true, it's scarcely what anyone ordinarily means by talking about justice, or, incidentally, by praising God as just. Now, the alternative option is to say that the objector has somehow misperceived, misunderstood the situation. The arrangements for creation, salvation, and damnation are, the reply might be, when properly understood, perfectly just. And to say that they are indeed just is to say something more than and something different from that God supports these arrangements. But this second option, which I believe is the one taken by Dr. Warren, and which I believe is common to the whole Church of Christ, takes it for granted that there is some proper standard of what is just and unjust, and that this standard is not an arbitrary function of the Creator's will. Surely it's by reference to this logically independent standard of what is just and unjust that Dr. Warren himself, and if I'm right, the whole Church of Christ, it's by reference to this independent standard that they all affirm that God is just and praise God for his justice. So, the upshot of this argument is that while I agree with Dr. Warren that certain things are categorically right or wrong, when I do this, I'm appealing to the same, perhaps mysterious, I suppose, objective standards to which he himself appeals when he labors to justify the ways of God to man. Where we disagree is, first, that I'm maintaining that these standards do not and cannot derive their authority from any fiat or command, divine or otherwise. And second, and not immediately to the present purpose, I'm maintaining that the arrangements which Dr. Warren and others attribute to their God seem to me to be, to the last degree, monstrous, unjust, and, if I may use the word, satanic. Well, as perhaps too often in this performance, I seem to have spent most of my time responding to an important point made by Dr. Warren, and to have left rather too little for an apology for my own atheism. Still, I doubt whether the situation is really as bad as that may have made it seem. For we are, in fact, between us, covering subjects which obviously do need to be covered, even if we're not doing it in the most systematic possible way. What I'll do now is to begin to outline what I think the systematic order would be. I don't think I should be able to finish that in the first slot, but I will start to do that, and the object of the exercise will be to provide people with a framework within which they can think of my, and of course of Dr. Warren's arguments, if they agree with me that this is the right framework. Now, I think that a systematic inquiry into the truth of some or any system of religious belief must begin from a completely this-worldly, naturalistic position. That's to say, we have to start from and with our common sense and our scientific knowledge of the universe around us. This is the undisputed knowledge available to people of all religions and of none. This starting point you might describe as, in a negative sense, universally atheist. That's to say that at this first stage we are not going to assert or to deny or even to entertain any religious beliefs at all. I call this negative atheism to distinguish it from the positive denial which I'm defending these evenings here in Denton. And I add the adjective universal to remind us that there have been and are innumerable notions of God with a big G or God with a small g. Though, of course, we're here confining our attention to one of these notions. And perhaps it's just worth saying, to bring this out a little more clearly, that the early Christians were, in a sense, rightly called atheists, as they were by many of their contemporaries, and their contemporaries were quite right in what they said, because, of course, the early Christians, like all Christians, did deny categorically the existence of various pagan gods, no doubt with a small g. We all are, all of us, indeed, atheists, positive atheists, in respect of the God or gods of most religions. Now, if you start from the position of naturalism and negative atheism. I emphasize the negative. I'm not suggesting that, you should all start by agreeing with me as positive atheists, and that's going to make it easy for me, isn't it, if you all start by agreeing with me from the beginning. I'm suggesting that we should all start from, take as given our everyday, undisputed, common sense knowledge of the world and our reservoir of scientific knowledge, a reservoir available to us even if we don't know much of it ourselves. Now, if we start from this position, we become ready to examine any and every proposal that there may be something, some being, some force or whatnot, beyond and behind the universe and the familiar things we take for granted. Now, someone who then tries to make out a case for any sort of religious belief will be confronted by two tasks. The first task he must try to fulfill is to introduce his own favored notion of God, explain what he means by God, what he wants us to believe. And then the second thing is he must provide us with some good reason for believing that this concept does in fact have application. Only when both these tasks have been satisfactorily completed will we have, or for that matter, will he have adequate warrant for his particular proposed belief. And it's because it seems to me that that's how the task should be undertaken, that it seems to me that someone who has to maintain the opposite view, he knows that this particular sort of God does not exist, would naturally and properly, if he was being quite systematic, start from this everyday knowledge, this undisputed knowledge shared by people of all religions or of none. He then considers the notion of God that's proposed and perhaps offers some objections to that, and after that he considers the arguments that might be put forward for saying that a God thus and thus described actually does exist. Now, this is the framework with which I'm operating, and if you think that this is a reasonable framework, you will then be able to put various things said by Dr. Warren and me within this framework and see for yourselves how the conclusions work out. And perhaps it's also worth my saying that someone could very well agree, I hope they will agree, that this is the right framework for systematic inquiry, even if they do not agree with my actual conclusions. Indeed, I believe that St. Thomas Aquinas accepted that a framework of this sort would be the right framework, though he, of course, believed that the two essential tasks could be satisfactorily completed from a theist point of view. Well, granting that this is the framework to go on, I'm going, as the evening goes on, though no doubt beginning on each occasion, taking up something that Dr. Warren has read, I'm going on to make some points first about stage one, the explanation of the notion of God, and then about stage two, the consideration of what, if any, reasons might be offered for saying that there was a God of that sort. And I have, of course, already said something under the first of these two heads. When I suggested in the third piece last night, not exactly that the concept of God, but the notion of God combined with certain assertions about God is incoherent, involves a contradiction. And the suggestion then was a familiar ancient one, though I was taking it in a particular form to allow for various things that are agreed between me and Dr. Warren. It's the old objection that you can't consistently say that God is all-powerful and all-good, and then attribute to him the either the sorts of arrangements about salvation and damnation which are attributed within the system, or, I think, for that matter, you can't assert all this and recognize and admit that there are the evils in the world that there are. And I think it would be natural for me actually to stop about 29 seconds early rather than to go on to another thing and muck it up.
Dr. Flew, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely happy tonight to be before you again to reply to the speech to which you just listened. And I want to say again, in harmony with what Gary Elias said, that Dr. Flew is certainly one of the most eminent, so far as scholarship is concerned, to defend the position which he has affirmed in this debate. His proposition, I know that God does not exist, could not be defended better by anyone, so far as I know, in England or America. Any weaknesses, therefore, that you may see manifested in what is being done in this debate in regard to that position cannot be attributed to the man. It must be attributed to the position. It is entirely in order for me, as the negative speaker in this discussion, as I follow each night what he has said and consider it item by item, statement by statement, but also to present certain other materials that are relative to the undermining of his case, of showing that he cannot establish it. And since it is certainly pertinent to my reply to what he has said tonight, I want to refer to the questions which he has answered, some of which he has answered and some of which he has not, of the 10 questions which I have given him according to our agreement. Now, some men who are given questions in such a discussion do not answer because they do not know how to answer. But Dr. Flew is a scholar of the highest rank. And when he does not answer, I must raise the question in my mind if he has merely decided that he will not rather than that he cannot. Or is it that he cannot answer and remain consistent with the doctrine which he has espoused? For he himself is on record again and again and again that any position which cannot maintain itself without self-contradiction ought to be abandoned, that the law of rationality would demand that one do that honesty would demand that one do that. Let me go hurriedly through these, and I'll have occasion more to say something more about them because there are some very, very important matters in these questions. Now, Dr. Flew is a man who has given a tremendous attention to the question of falsification. Any position he alleges of which you cannot answer this question, what would have to occur or to have occurred to constitute for you a disproof of the love of or the existence of God? This is a question which he has posed to theists again and again and again all over the world. Now it has been posed to him, and what do you suppose he has answered? Here is the first question. What would have to occur or to have occurred to convince you that your proposition is false? There was not one word written there, not a single letter. Secondly, what would have to occur or to have occurred to convince you that my proposition is true? Not one word was written. Next, true or false, the following statement is a precisely stated proposition. Either a woman was first on earth before any human baby, or a human baby was first on earth before any woman, and he says false. Now, Dr. Flew, surely you are the only one in this audience who agrees that that is not a precisely stated proposition. Everybody knows the meaning of the words. There's nothing ambiguous about the words. There's nothing ambiguous about the way it's stated. Now, of course, he's already made confession by recognizing that nothing non-human transformed into a human being, and nothing that was non-human gave birth to a human being. So he's given up the possibility of any human being ever being here by virtue of evolution. And if atheism is true, that is what absolutely must occur. He therefore has already given up the debate, but still he persists in refusing to deal with this question. He did not answer the fourth question. And I will now skip on down to question 6 because I will refer to the others in just a moment. True or false, if the Nazis had captured you and your regiment and had given you the choice of joining them in their efforts to exterminate people, you would have had the objective moral obligation to die rather than join them in the murder of men, women, and children, and he says it's true. Now note the admission. I indicated to you last night that no atheist will live according to the implications of his doctrine. The implications of his doctrine is that there is no objective moral law, that there is no law higher than what mere human beings invent. Last night he answered the question which indicated before there was a human being, there was no value in the universe. Therefore, value must be nothing more than a function of the human mind. It's nothing more than an invention of men and women. And yet he said he would have had to die, was under the moral obligation to die, rather than to join with the Nazis. He therefore admits the point that I made last evening, that the Nuremberg trials were based not upon merely international law that human beings had invented, but a higher law that transcended so-called international law. Now further note in question 8, the judges at Nuremberg, now this is true or false, the judges at Nuremberg would have been justified in concluding that since the Nazis were obeying the law of their own land, the Nazis were not guilty of real objective moral wrong in torturing and or murdering 6 million Jewish men, women, or children, and he said false. Now, in other words, these men functioning under international law, which last night he said was the basis by which they were judged, that they could not have decided to have let them go free. Therefore, he is recognizing again a higher law above international law, above any law that mere human beings have invented. And therefore, Justice Robert Jackson was right when he said that we condemn these men on the basis of a higher law which transcends the provincial and the transient. My friends, this debate will close without my learned colleague answering that point. And the reason why it's true is because he has a conscience within his soul. He cannot tolerate the idea of the Nazis putting little children into boxcars coated with quicklime so that they will die, not only to die, but to die agonizingly. He simply cannot tolerate it. He must recognize that it's wrong, and wrong above any mere human law that has been invented. And there's only one explanation of that, and that is the law of God Almighty. Now I come to his speech. How much time now do I have? 12 minutes. All right. Dr. Flew still has not realized that for these 2 nights, he, not I, is in the affirmative. He still keeps trying to have me to come in and prove the existence of God. Dr. Flew, I suggest that you go back and reread the proposition. It says, I, Anthony G. and Flew, know that God does not exist. I have pointed out his obligation as an affirmative speaker to present an argument, a sound argument. Now, a sound argument is one in which the argument is valid, which means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. But in a valid argument, the premises might be false, and even the conclusion false. But in a sound argument, you must not only have a valid argument, but the premises must be true. I have asked, I have pleaded, I have begged for the argument that has premises which then warrant the deduction, therefore I, A.G.N. Flew, know that God does not exist. Now all of these questions that he raises, which tends to put me in the affirmative, which will begin tomorrow evening, have nothing whatever to do with that. And I shall show as I go through his speech that he has not till this good moment made an argument which he even claims to be a sound argument, the conclusion of which is, therefore I know that God does not exist. He says, I come now to my atheistic position. I have noted that in recently Dr. Flew's book, The Presumption of Atheism, he hedges away from thoroughgoing atheism in which you say, as he did in this debate, I know that God does not exist, to merely saying that what I mean by that is that I'm not a theist. But Dr. Flew, in this debate, you have said, I know that God does not exist, and that is your responsibility. He then promises us that he's going to tell us why he has espoused the atheistic position, and we're still waiting. He promises us that he's going to do it, and he promises and promises in every speech, and he still has not given it. I will give you my word that in my very first speech, I will give you an argument that it will be valid, and that I am convinced with all of my heart the premises are true. I will not merely promise you to give an argument in sustaining of my proposition. He says, Warren denies you can hold objective values without a creator and that we're left with only subjective view. Yes, I certainly do hold that. And by your answer to questions tonight, Dr. Flew, you agreed. In your answers to question number 6, you said there's a higher law above the international law that condemned those men and even sent them to execution. Now, Dr. Flew, what was that law higher than the international law? What was that law that meant that these judges could not change and say these men were innocent after all because they were obeying the law of their own land? Why couldn't those Germans have met their own needs and desires according to Dr. Flew, and therefore have said it meets our needs, as indeed Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's hatchet man, said it is our moral duty to exterminate these people. It meets our needs and our desires. The very basis upon which Dr. Flew argues was the basis upon which the Nazis argued. And last night, to suggest, as he sought to struggle, even though he admits now that the law of excluded middle is true, that every precisely stated proposition is true or false, he still refuses to apply it to objects. Bear in mind that the law of excluded middle applies to objects as well as to things. That means that every object in the world either has a certain property or it doesn't. This lectern is either orange or it isn't. It either has the property of being orange or it doesn't. I either have the property of being 9 feet tall or I do not. Now, every object there is in the world either has the property of being human or it doesn't. His whole case depends upon some invented, talk about incoherent concepts. Of all the incoherent concepts that I have ever heard is there were some beings at one time, starting from the time that there were things that were non-human, but we come into a period when there were things that were neither human nor non-human, and then the humans come on the scene. He has admitted that nothing can be transformed from a non-human to a human, but last night in his rejoinder, lo and behold, and I'm sure it shocked you to your very soul when he said humans can become non-human. When senile people, at least he said, I have encountered people that, so far as I know, are no longer human. But even in admitting that, he joins the Nazis in holding that since they are no longer human, then why not exterminate them? But note how he again contradicts his position on the law of excluded middle, because he did not say that they become neither human nor non-human. He says they become non-human. Go back and check the tape, Dr. Flew, and see if that isn't what you said. Now, that's the very thing I contended for. Every object that's ever lived in this world is either human or non-human. There is no way you can fix up the theory of evolution to avoid the dilemma in which Dr. Flew finds himself tonight. It isn't because he hasn't thought about it before. It isn't because he isn't a great scholar. It's because it's false to the very core, and there's nothing he can do to answer it. Then he expresses outrage at the Nazis and the communists. And in doing so, he admits this higher law, which I've already indicated. And he cries that values are not arbitrary, based upon merely the individual of the society. And if it is not the case that law is merely something of the disapproval or approval of an individual or a society or a part of a society, then it's not something simply invented. It's something that is eternal in its very nature and is based upon, of course, the relationship that it has to God. There is nothing in that or anything that he has said in the entire speech that has anything to do with proving that God does not exist. If you were listening to him and didn't know what proposition he was supposed to be affirming, I'm sure you would never conclude from what he has said that that was the proposition he's supposed to be affirming. He then alleges that Dr. Warren will accept only or some value system only as endorsed by a creator. Now, Dr. Flew, I want to insist that you recognize that it's your responsibility to show how you know that there is no higher law which has God's endorsement. That's your responsibility. You need to show, you need to say, this is true, therefore, here is the law by which men are judged, and I know, not merely that you're guessing, not merely that you're giving some sort of intellectual enterprise that's curious to you as a sort of intellectual study, but that you say, this is true, therefore I know that the moral values by which men live have absolutely no connection and cannot do so to any higher or supreme being. Then he refers again to Plato. It didn't help him last evening. It didn't help him tonight. There's absolutely no argument at all in it that holds that God does not exist. You must show that you know that God has no such law. Dr. Flew, you must make an argument, and you have not done it as yet. He then brings up Calvinism. He brings up Aquinas. I have absolutely no connection with either one of them. They're entirely beside the point in this discussion. He says Dr. Warren takes it for granted that there's some objective standard, the will of God, that God is just, and so forth, and that I agree that certain things are categorically right or wrong. How much time? Now, Dr. Flew, that has nothing again to say. I'm going through your speech, not because it really is relevant to the proposition, but to let this audience know that I'm dealing with everything you've said. There is nothing in that that says, therefore, there is no God. Then he says the arrangements which Dr. Warren attributes to God are really satanic. The basic teachings, then, of Jesus Christ are satanic, but the inventions of Dr. Anthony G. N. Flew are wonderful and good and righteous and holy and just. Upon what basis, Dr. Flew, would you even strive to be righteous or holy or good when at one time nothing existed of value and nothing of value came into being until human beings did? And if it's not then therefore a function purely and simply of the human mind, then I see no way of squaring things with what you have said. Now I want to pay attention to some points of some things that have occurred already in this discussion by way of summation, by way of tying things together. It is the responsibility of the negative speaker to help the audience to see what is occurring. Now, Dr. Flew has again and again in his writings chided religious people for not being rational. That is, for not accepting the implications of the beginning point, of not being willing to draw only those conclusions for which you have conclusive evidence. And I'm in harmony with that. Certainly Christian theism is in harmony with it. But yet I want you to know, and I'm not going to get through with this, Dr. Flew, there's going to be a lot more of this before we're through tonight to show you the kind of self-contradiction on concessions and admissions of defeat that already have occurred in this discussion. You've heard some already from his answering of questions tonight. In the face of this claim, in the face of this urging that we follow the law of rationality, I want you to note that the concessions, some of the concessions at least, made during the sessions last evening. In regard to question number 2 on last evening, on this question Dr. Flew concedes, number 1, that it's possible for men to be guilty of real, objective, moral wrong. That the actual case of men being guilty of real moral wrong, namely the Nazis' torturing of the Jews, that is, an actual case of it has occurred. It's not only possible, it has occurred. That there is a higher law by which human thoughts and deeds may be judged. That moral wrong is not only subjective. Of course, there can be subjective wrong. Somebody can say, well, I feel that it's wrong. I have this disapproval of it. But he's admitting there's something else. There is moral objective wrong. He's admitted the basis of prosecution by Justice Robert Jackson was correct. That is, that the Nazis were guilty of violating a higher moral law that transcends the provincial and the transient. And that means the law of any given nation during a given period of time is not decisive in deciding right and wrong, that there is a higher law, even above international law, by which men can be tried, convicted, and even executed. And that's what actually happened with the Nazis at Nuremberg. Also, concessions made regard to question number 3. On this question, Dr. Flew concedes that there can be no wrong unless you violate some law. Note that. There can be no wrong unless you violate some law. Then he admits the Nazis did not violate the law of England. They did not violate the law of the United States. They did not violate their own law, the law of Germany. They did violate some law, but it was not merely international law now we find in the questions tonight. It was therefore some law higher than that which transcends the provincial and the transient. And that could be nothing else than the law of God. I challenge Dr. Flew to explain what law there is above this international law by which he has put himself in this predicament in the answering of these questions. In regard to the 5th question last evening, on this question he concedes that you can deduce from empirical fact the fact of the state of affairs of a class of things transcendent of the universe. Now, that's the very thing that all of these years he's argued you can't do. But now he has said that you can argue that here the class of things which are transcendent of the universe. Of course, God is the only member of that class. But now he is saying you can reason from empirical fact in this world to the condition or state or number of members of that class. To do so is to admit the basic thrust of the theistic argument from observation of empirical facts of various sorts in this world to a consideration of conclusion so that it constitute knowledge which he claims of that class which transcends the world. Thank you very much, and I invite you to hear Dr. Flew.
Today, Dr. A.G.N. Flew has held to the atheistic position in his affirmation, "I know that God does not exist." Dr. Thomas B. Warren has defended God's existence as the negative disputant. The Churches of Christ are not only committed to the existence of God, but are also committed to the restoration of New Testament Christianity. We invite you to visit our services. Any questions or comments concerning this debate are welcome.